Hi, I'm Jennifer Peterson, a film historian teaching at Woodbury University in Los Angeles. I would like to thank Giovanna Fossati and the Film Museum for inviting me to speak here today. Thanks also to Daria Talk for help in putting this presentation together. I'm currently writing my second book about film history and the environment, entitled Cinema's Ecological Past, Film History, Nature, and Endangerment Before 1960, under contract for publication by Columbia University Press. Some of the concepts I discuss here are drawn from my recent essay, Cinema, Nature, and Endangerment, published in Ends of Cinema, edited by Richard Grusin and Jocelyn Sapaniak Galice. I was fortunate to conduct research at the Film Museum for my first book, Education in the School of Dreams, Travelogues in Early Nonfiction Film. For this presentation and its accompanying screening, I'm excited to share with you a set of films I've selected from the collection depicting water, ecosystems, and animals. A number of these films I had never seen before. So, what can archival films teach us about global warming and mass extinction? Can film history help raise ecological awareness today? This presentation explores some of the ways in which films depicting nature from 100 years ago can help us come to terms with the daunting set of environmental emergencies we face in this moment. I use examples from the Film Museum's collection of silent-era nature films to show how cinema's role as a machine for visualizing ecosystems can help us trace the evolving relationship between humans and nature in modernity. If photochemical film has reached the end of its first life cycle, superseded by digital media, yet persisting in limited forms, perhaps film history can help us understand another much larger death now underway, that of ecosystems and the animals and plants they support, commonly referred to as the sixth mass extinction. Perhaps film history might even help us understand the threat we are now facing, the end of livable climate conditions in the 21st century, and the uneven distribution of human and non-human suffering that entails. Perhaps, in serving as evidence of endangered species and habitats, archival films of nature's past might bear potential to spark ecological awakening. I have designed this talk in homage to the illustrated lecture tradition. In each of these 5 sections, I will present visual examples of silent archival films, still images, digital GIFs, and digitized video clips, all from films in the collection. Borrowing from Giovanna Fossati's concept of the archival life of film, which describes, quote, what happens to the film artifact once it enters the archive, end quote, I invite you to think about these films in terms of their life cycle as material trace elements functioning in the culture at large. This talk is driven by the question, what is the ecological life of film? In order to talk about film and the environment, it's important to understand cinema as coeval with and symptomatic of the Anthropocene, which, as theorist Bruno Latour has argued, should replace the concept of modernity in contemporary history. The framework of modernity has held high importance in cinema studies since the 1990s, and I substitute Anthropocene for modernity to signal the huge potential of realigning the field of cinema and media studies with environmental concerns. The term Anthropocene is well known by now, but here's a brief review. It was introduced in 2000 by biologist Eugene Stormer and Nobel Prize-winning chemist Paul Crutzen, who proposed that the rapid expansion of humans has transformed the Earth system so radically that it has entered a new epoch, distinct from the Holocene era. There's continuing scientific debate about when the Anthropocene began, but each proposed onset date is tied to a measurable indexical trace left on the planet, known as a golden spike, such as carbon dioxide, nitrogen, or radionuclides measurable in ice and rock cores. Among the leading contenders for dating the start of the Anthropocene are 1945 with the Trinity atomic bomb test, which heralded the onset of the nuclear age and its subsequent plutonium fallout, Or 1782, when the steam engine was invented by James Watt, resulting in worldwide carbon deposits by the new coal-powered industries. Or 1610, when the colonization of the Americas can be traced by a dip in planetary carbon dioxide levels. I personally favor this last option, known as the Orbis spike, because it foregrounds the role of colonization and capitalism in anthropogenic climate change. Scientific consensus on the Anthropocene will come from the International Commission on Stratigraphy, which has yet to officially adopt the term. Despite scientific hesitation, many other disciplines have taken up the term Anthropocene with great interest. A consensus has formed around the idea that we have entered a new geological epoch in which human actions have irrevocably altered the course of the planet's life cycle. The arts and humanities have been particularly enthusiastic in adopting the term, though its ethical meaning is the subject of fierce debate. First of all, the universalizing nature of the term is objectionable to many, and it's crucial to emphasize that not all humans are equally responsible for global warming. There's no doubt that the resource-consuming capitalists of the global north bear most of the responsibility for this crisis, which disproportionately harms people with less wealth and fewer resources. The term capitalocene has been suggested as one alternative that foregrounds this uneven culpability. Another debate centers on whether the term privileges or decenters the anthropos, meaning humans. Some have argued that the Anthropocene reinscribes an anthropocentric view of human dominance and functions as just another form of speciesism. However, in my opinion, it foregrounds just the opposite. To me, the Anthropocene displaces humans from the center of the universe by redefining us as merely one actant among many, in a geological history in which the Earth will, of course, outlast humans. From this perspective, global warming is the Earth system's response to the blundering, short-sighted actions of some humans, all of whom it will eventually expel. Regardless of what we call the era, humanity's material traces are now embedded in the Earth's soil, trees, ice, cores, and manifested in plastic microfibers in the ocean, the food chain, and in our own bodies. But at the same time, as this film shows us, as all film shows us, the Anthropocene has left different kinds of traces in culture. Certainly, cinema is an industrial product that leaves a measurable waste footprint, but I'm interested in cinema's ability to trace cultural forces. I contend that archival films can be understood geologically as an anthropogenic trace element, a form of cultural debris that can be studied as a material record of the complex ideological construct we call nature. This is important for providing a picture of old nature, will help us understand what is happening with new nature in the time of global warming and mass extinction. In stark contrast, then, to the postmodernist argument made by Frederick Jameson and others that history and nature have been eradicated in the contemporary world, climate change teaches us that, as Andreas Malm has written, history has sprung alive through a nature that has done likewise. I'm showing you here a clip from a film shot in Sumatra in 1927 by the pioneering Dutch filmmaker Willy Mullens. This was a promotional film made to show the Dutch East Indies palm oil industry in a favorable light. In this section of the film, we see how the rainforest has been cut down in order to plant fields of oil palm trees. We see the division of labor between the workers who perform manual labor on the plantation and the white owners who control the wealth. Today, palm oil is found in a large percentage of commercial products, from packaged foods to shampoo, but when this film was made, palm oil was not such a globally dominant product. That difference, produced by the passage of time, is part of this film's fascination. Here we see oil palm trees that are only 2 years old, which the previous intertitle just told us. Dutch colonists brought oil palms to Indonesia from Africa, where it had been cultivated for thousands of years. This film functions as a cultural trace of the palm oil industry 100 years ago. The film visualizes exterior surface details as they appeared at the time: a landscape, plants, people, and industry. It also shows us how all these things were represented. We notice the film's celebratory tone, its uncritical depiction of economic and racial hierarchies, its steadfast belief that oil palm agriculture is a good thing. But palm oil is the major cause of deforestation in Indonesia and Malaysia, and we can see that deforestation happening in this film. Palm oil agriculture is thus a major contributor to both global warming and biodiversity loss. When rainforests are cut down to plant oil palm trees, not only do we lose a major source of global carbon sequestration, but one of the richest global habitats for endangered plants and animals is destroyed, and orangutans, Sumatran tigers, and the Bornean rhino are pushed further towards extinction. Palm oil agriculture is also a threat to indigenous land rights. On the other hand, palm oil is a highly efficient crop, and it's been extremely important for the economies of developing nations, including small farmers. There are plans for growing palm oil more sustainably, but for some decades now, palm oil crops have been one of the more potent symbols of environmental degradation. Images of palm oil monoculture are commonly used to illustrate deforestation and habitat loss today. Palm oil thus epitomizes the complexity of environmental problems and their solutions. Archival nature films show ecosystems and species as they appeared at the time of filming, as recorded by the cinematic apparatus. But cinema is, of course, not a pure indexical reproduction of the world. Rather, cinema renders the world, shapes it in a particular way, even if it still bears an indexical trace, as I believe nonfiction images such as these do, even in digital form. I'm glossing over a large body of film theory here to get to my point. Rendering has a simple dictionary definition, meaning to depict or represent. But it has an additional meaning in the digital sphere, where rendering means to use a computer program to generate an image from a set of data. Any of you who've worked with digital video editing are familiar with the time-consuming step of rendering, which gives your images their final appearance. I believe that archival nature films render the natural world in two ways. First, they depict or show the natural world and how the natural world was filmed. And second, they depict or show the way in which nature was conceptualized at the time the film was made. These two stills from the French film Oiseaux aquatiques d'Afrique occidentale française will help me explain. These images are from a 1925 Pathé film, which you'll watch in the screening. The film's intertitles give just the barest details about the birds shown, but what the film does provide in abundance are realistic visual images. These images render the world in two ways. First, the film depicts birds in a specific time and place. On the left is a pied kingfisher in Senegal. Second, the film depicts a particular idea of nature, that it can be studied and documented using scientific and visual techniques, that it should be understood in the context of its native habitat, and that it is worth conserving. Even this first kind of rendering is complex. Here we have a close-up and a long shot of birds in their habitat. The close-up provides a perspective that we wouldn't be able to achieve on our own. The long shot provides some visual information about habitat that we could not access unless we traveled to West Africa where this was filmed. Although we're looking at still images now, the film, of course, provides a realistic illusion of movement. Finally, this film has applied stencil coloring, which contributes to its aesthetic of realism in the context of the 1920s when it was made, though these colors don't conform to our sense of realism today. All these elements of the film, its images and intertitles, diegetic and non-diegetic elements, are components of its rendering of the world. The film serves as evidence of the bird species shown and their relative abundance at the time, and I'm happy to report that African kingfishers are still plentiful today. The film also serves as evidence of cinema-specific formal and technological qualities: framing choices, intertitles, applied colors, 35mm nitrate film, and so forth. But it's the second kind of rendering, this idea of rendering as an image generated from a set of ideas or ideologies, that concerns me here. To draw upon Roland Barthes' famous formulation, we can unpack this film's rendering of nature as myth, a secondary order of signification. Let me expand upon this point with another example. Let's just watch this film for a moment. The intertitle says, "This film shows the first recordings ever taken of the golden eagle." The golden eagle resides here in the Scottish Highlands. Operators are headed to the faraway steep cliff where the golden eagle builds his nest. A shelter of stones and heather plants is set up in the vicinity of the nest. The apparatus is set up in this shelter, and the operators spend many cold and monotonous hours there. So these are the opening minutes of a British film from the renowned Secrets of Nature series. Its English language title is The Golden Eagle. It was photographed by H.A. Gilbert and Arthur Brooke and released by British Instructional Films in 1925. Though several surviving films from this series have been made available on DVD and online, as far as I know, this film has not been made widely accessible before. And here we are, over 2 minutes into the film, and we haven't even seen any birds yet. Instead, the film establishes the landscape and habitat of the birds and spends a lot of time depicting the process of wildlife filming. Let's watch a clip now from later in the film. Few things are as graceful as the eagle in flight. Slow shots show this even more clearly. After 10 weeks, the young are almost as large as their parents. A lot of power is now consumed for flying exercises. And then we see the cameraman drinking what I can only assume must be some tea. Previous traditions of natural history had focused on taxidermied specimens or on zoo animals, but this film renders birds in their habitat, which was still a fairly new innovation in nature filmmaking in the 1920s. Following the conventions of popular nature study, the film presents simple and captivating visual information about its species. The film also conveys the importance birds held in the early conservation movement. So at their most basic, archival nature films render the natural world by showing us what certain species, habitats, or landscapes looked like at the moment of their filming, and they show how the filming was done. And then the second order of representation is that they render an idea of nature in this moment in the early 20th century. The idea of nature conveyed in this film is that of popular science and the early 20th century nature study tradition, which involved a simple presentation of visual information motivated by an idea of the inherent value of species. Nature, as Raymond Williams once wrote, is perhaps the most complex word in the language, end quote. Nature contains competing meanings and has changed drastically over time. In silent era nature films, we see the natural history and conservation tradition at work, but we can also see a contrasting tradition of mastery in the many films depicting resource extraction, such as this 1926 film by the Fox Film Corporation showing logging in North America entitled Wood from the Far North, which you will see in the screening. There are many kinds of resource extraction, but some of the most important forms shown in silent era nonfiction are logging, mining, and hunting. Each of these are common enough to form nonfiction genres of their own. Since you'll see a North American logging film in the screening, I want to show you now a clip from a film depicting logging in Australia. How are the mighty fallen? So a film from the nature study tradition might begin with the same intertitle that this film began with. This is the forest primeval. But that kind of a film would go on to document the flora and fauna of the forest. This, however, is a resource extraction film, which renders nature exclusively in terms of its use value, explicitly stated in the intertitle explaining that Jarrah and Kerry are two of the most valuable timber trees in the world. The film documents the process of logging, felling the tree, dragging the huge trunks out of the forest with cattle, and so forth. Southwestern Australia, which is the only place on Earth where these trees grow, is a biodiversity hotspot, home to many endangered species, as well as several indigenous groups, including the Nyungar people, who've lived there for thousands of years. It faces massive deforestation challenges now due to logging, climate change, fire, and invasive species. As with the palm oil film, here we see an industry as it looked a century ago. In 1923, when this film was made, logging of Jarrah and Kerry trees was still relatively selective, but it increased dramatically as new technologies were introduced across the 20th century, to the extent that today, because of extensive logging, only 1% of Western Australia is still forested. One significance of this film, then, is that it depicts the beginning of this trajectory of destruction, and it depicts the attitudes that led to the climate collapse we're witnessing today. This is another resource extraction film, here showing the famous marble industry of Carrara, Italy. This film captures an ancient industry in a particular moment in time. Michelangelo sculpted his statues out of Carrara marble, and quarries were operating here in the time of ancient Rome. The marble today is not even close to being exhausted, but this mining practice definitely qualifies as a human-altered landscape. Carrara mining is prominently featured in the 2018 environmental documentary Anthropocene, The Human Epoch. Let me show you a clip from this film now. The film begins with a sweeping landscape panorama of the Apuan Alps before turning to the mining itself. In 1914, when this film was made, dynamite was used to blast open the entrance to a quarry before the marble was mined by hand. That says the square planing of the marble blocks. This resource extraction film, like most from this era, is interested in depicting the resource itself, in this case marble, along with the process of its extraction. In focusing on an industry, it can be described as an industrial film, or it can be placed into the category Salome Skwirsky has called the process genre. Like many such films, it aestheticizes the commodity produced more than it values the human labor depicted. There is perhaps some irony, then, in the knowledge that Carrara was the center of an anarchist political movement in the late 19th and early 20th century, which grew out of the local stoneworkers culture. The driving force of capitalism may be masked or disavowed in these films, but it is everywhere discernible as a key principle of nature, envisioned as a source of free gifts to be mastered and used. Archival nature films activate a powerful affective mode of endangerment. Nature films made before the onset of the popular environmental movement of the 1960s do not typically present animals and plant species as endangered, but thanks to the passage of time, these films' original meanings have changed. Now that some of these films have been saved and are being rediscovered, they have the potential to be revitalized for new uses. This reimagining has been enabled by the growth of media archives, thanks to the efforts of archivists, scholars, filmmakers, collectors, and fans, and it has entered a new phase with the confluence of Web 2.0, global warming, and mass extinction. In a particularly generative essay, science historians Fernando Vidal and Nelia Diaz coined the term endangerment sensibility to describe a particularly acute way of understanding the world through an attitude attuned to loss, disappearance, and preservation. Vidal and Diaz are interested in endangerment as it applies to a range of entities, not just endangered biological species, but also cultural artifacts, places, and languages. Endangerment relies on scientific knowledge, gathering information, making inventories, studying, and ranking. To classify an entity as endangered means to bring about efforts to preserve, archive, and catalog it. Such a classification is a declaration of value, and endangered entities, quote, acquire significant political and moral valence inside and outside science, end quote. The endangerment sensibility thus describes an effective response to hard data. Vidal and Diaz characterize the endangerment sensibility's central features as a certain sentimental impulse, empathy extending to animals, landscapes, and marginalized humans, as well as attention to one's own affective experience, end quote. While awareness of the phenomenon of extinction certainly predates the mid-20th century, the current understanding of loss and destruction is new, quote, fraught with guilty feelings and a sense of responsibility, end quote. Not just a sensibility, but a regime, endangerment names both a structure of affect and a set of complexly determined responses. Quote, the endangerment outlook is both proleptic and regretful, end quote. Vidal and D.S. Wright. Anticipating a future in which something is lost and anticipating a mourning process before the loss happens. The endangerment sensibility implies a perspective of scanning across different moments of history, incorporating a sense of what was, what is, and what might be. In this sense of multiple time frames, it shares the temporal disjunction of the Anthropocene concept itself. The endangerment sensibility is traumatic, but also potentially emancipatory. It looks backward and forward at the same time and is thus useful for the larger project of awakening to ecological awareness. Cinema, with its power to freeze time and capture the excess noise characteristic of the photographic image, is an ideal medium for registering this sense of endangerment. But cinema, by which I mean not only analog film, but also the old exhibition context these films formerly inhabited, is itself now a relic. These films come alive today, not so much in the cinema, but on digital screens. As reconfigured in the era of digital media, archival fragments hold a potential to activate unanticipated responses. As it heralds new forms of visualization by remediating outmoded forms, perhaps digital media and even film history itself can help us shift into a new mode of thinking to meet the challenge of living with limited possibilities. Here's a clip from a Pathé film about an orangutan. This says, perhaps he dreams of his native soil, Borneo, with its dense, warm jungles. The lush vegetation gives the orangutan its food for the taking. Life still reserves him the bliss of warming his mummy-like limbs in the sun while devouring some juicy fruit. His lively little eyes are a testament to his ingenuity, but his protruding face ranks him among the lower beings. So as you can see, this film invokes a biological racism that envisions intelligence as measurable by appearances and cranial measurements, ranking creatures and humans according to an evolutionary hierarchy. This white suprematist theory, common in the 19th century and well into the 20th, is out of step with the environmental discourse of our own time, and yet the early conservation movement was steeped in this kind of thinking. Indeed, the first wildlife preserves were set aside for hunting purposes. In the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, considered a pioneering environmentalist, was an important early conservationist because he was an avid hunter. Hunting, outdoors culture, and ideas of masculinity are central to the history of conservation and the founding of national parks and wildlife refuges. While I don't have time to go into these connections here, what I can do is point out how these films visualize these connections explicitly. Here's a clip from one last Pathé film, Seal Hunting in the Tasmanian Sea, which illustrates this point clearly. The film depicts gentlemen hunters shooting seals to get their skins, assisted by some local fishermen. The landscape of crashing waves and rocky seashore is beautiful, but the seals are treated as nothing more than creatures to be harvested for their fur. The Australian fur seal became endangered by the early 20th century due to hunting, and they are now a protected species. In the screening, you will see another hunting film in full, which continues this theme, foregrounding animal capture and death in a way that today's audiences find horrible, particularly because the polar bear, shown in this film, has become a symbol of climate change due to its vulnerability to global warming. So what can archival films do? Films do not have stable or singular meanings, of course. As Tom Gunning has written, films are, quote, texts whose meaning is derived not simply from the maker's intentions or the film's own immanent form, but through a complex process of making meaning in the interaction of films with viewers and institutions, end quote. Films' meanings change over time, and their meanings change in interaction with different viewers. What I think archival films can do then is reveal ecological truths due to the passage of time. If endangerment is a key sensibility for this moment of dawning mass environmental awareness, it also functions as a structure of feeling, a powerful mode of affect for our current moment. These beautiful and sometimes horrifying films show us that archival films can move us to feel something about animals, habitats, and the environment. Archival films can show us fragments of natural history, and they can show us how nature was envisioned in a past time. Sometimes the ideas about biodiversity shown in these films can be jarring, such as this film, in which a girl feeds an ice cream cone to a tiger. At other times, the ideas about animals, plants, and habitats shown in these films are rendered aesthetic. Beautiful but creepy, these long dead insects might even make your skin crawl. All the examples I've shown you here today were made by European or North American filmmakers, and that's what I'm doing here, using these films to unearth a history of dominant cultural ideas about nature from a century ago. One of the challenges of coming to terms with climate change is the immensity of the problem. Film, with its unparalleled ability to direct and focus our attention, provides opportunities to shape our emotional understanding of the global calamity, bringing it down to human scale. Situating film history in relation to natural history entails bridging incommensurate timescales, but it's precisely this disorienting perspective of the Anthropocene viewing condition that revitalizes these old films with new meaning. Thanks very much for watching my presentation.